Radio 365 Sports, and one of the stories we want to get to is the story about the college football coaching salaries in the Pac-12, but we'll get to that in a moment as Jon joins us again on Sikkim 365 Radio 365 Sports. Jon, you know, the college football playoff expansion's in the mud. It's been neutered, at least for now, although at some point it's going to happen. How much of that has any impact whatsoever if it moves forward on the Pac-12 and their television deal?
Well, yeah, it's interesting, right? Because you got to figure that there's not an unlimited pot of money, right? So is the Pac-12 better off? You know, the Pac-12 needs the playoff to expand quickly because it's really struggling to get a team when it's a 4-team event. But at the same time, you know, ESPN, Fox, and others may have a little bit more money to spend on conference media rights if they haven't shelled out however many hundreds of millions or billions for the playoff. I mean, I have to think ESPN's got some kind of master plan, but they don't probably know exactly who's going to be bidding on the playoff. And it's an interesting, you know, interconnection between those two events.
Jon, how does with George Kliavkoff taking over a couple years ago and kind of now, I don't want to say figuring things out to the, you know, like he said in an interview, like, you know, he came from a different world and everything's been different. How does the league feel about his leadership so far and leading them into this TV deal because of his different perspective?
Well, I think there's two things. One is that any change in leadership was going to be an improvement, for sure. But he has, I think, you know, they would give him, regardless of that, he would get very high marks from the schools for what he's done as a kind of a face of the conference and providing some proper messaging on national issues like the playoff or name, image, likeness, but also for work he's done behind the scenes to rebuild trust that had really broken down between the conference office and the schools, and to kind of get everybody rowing the boat in the same direction, where previously it was basically, you know, 13 different directions. And so I think in that regard, the conference is better positioned to move forward with whatever the media rights looks like, whatever the playoff looks like, whatever name, image, likeness evolves into. I think they're much better positioned because of a lot of the work that he's done behind the scenes, rebuilding basically the culture of the conference.
How much of that positioning would you say also has to do with the alliance? Has that been, or was that made more bigger at the time than it really has been over the last year? Has that been as powerful of an alliance as people expected to be? How do you kind of view that whole scenario?
You know, the alliance is kind of, I think the public and the media views it as a little bit of a letdown, right? It hasn't really. The three conferences did vote against expansion, right? They all had their own reasons, but otherwise, I think the alliance is viewed as a letdown because there hasn't been any firm scheduling matchups created. I take a little bit of a contrarian view. I think the alliance was a huge success because, in my opinion, the number one goal of the alliance was to prevent additional realignment beyond Texas and Oklahoma. And in that regard, for the Pac-12, I view it as having been a defensive mechanism. If you sign in or, you know, get the Big Ten and the ACC presidents to agree to promote stability, you are naturally getting them to basically say, we're not going to come try to poach USC, right? Mm-hmm. Or Oregon or Washington. And so in that regard, I think the alliance really worked well for the Pac-12 because it stabilized the environment.
Jon, how valuable, or is it, and is it something that's been incredibly a disappointment? We've read articles about the Pac-12 network. What's going on with that? Has George Kliavkoff found the diamond in the rough on how to make that valuable, or can it be?
No, there is no diamond in the rough for the next couple of years because their contracts for distribution are completely locked in until the summer of 2024. So there's nothing really he can do until then. The only thing he can do is set a strategy that's going to help starting with the next media cycle, right? And so the question is going to basically be, I think it seems like the Pac-12 networks are going to continue to exist in the next media cycle, but they may be streaming only, and they may just be for women's and Olympic sports, right? I would be very surprised if there is 1 minute of a Pac-12 football game on the Pac-12 networks, unless it becomes a model like the SEC, where ESPN owns the majority and is the main distributor, or like the Big Ten, where Fox distributes, right? If the Pac-12 networks remains a standalone, wholly owned entity, there's not going to be any football on there, or men's basketball probably.
John, I want to go back to what you said about the alliance and preventing further realignment and poaching. We have a ton of people on our message board and the chat room and everything who have this idea that the Arizona schools are doing nothing but itching to go somewhere else.
Wrong.
But yeah, and can you kind of explain the why that would not be the case, so that I can have this on tape the next time somebody sends us that conspiracy theory?
I mean, I can understand why fans would think it, and even fans of the Arizona schools might think it, but it doesn't. I don't think personally the Big 12 doesn't work for those schools. It doesn't work politically, academically, or culturally. Right? Those schools are aligned with the West Coast in every regard. The Arizona schools, their boards of regents, their presidents, their trustees, they want to be aligned academically with the California schools. Right? There is an immense value for those universities, not just athletics, but for those universities to be part of a conference that's got 4 of the best schools in the country, right? So from that standpoint, it doesn't make any sense. Most of those schools have huge fan bases and donor bases in Southern California, and Southern California is also where they recruit. So you would be kind of untethering them from so much of what makes them viable entities, right? I mean, those are not the Big 12 is Texas, right? I mean, even if Texas isn't going to be in it, it's still kind of a Texas Southern Plains orbit. The Arizona schools have no business being in an orbit in the Southern Plains. It's kind of like Colorado did. Colorado was a West Coast school culturally, politically, academically. Same with the Arizona schools.
John,
I hope that helps. I hope that helps.
No, it made a lot of sense. Made a lot of sense, yeah.
And I think a lot of that, too, comes just from the uncertainty, though, Paul. There is a lot of it's just wishful thinking, but I think some of it, too, is just the uncertainty at times with California and how that state's being ran and NIL and things like that they feel like maybe that will cause some, great disagreement that causes others to go elsewhere. But you've laid it out there great. But speaking of NIL, John, how do you feel like the Pac-12 has adapted? Obviously, USC is one of those schools that immediately comes to mind for people. But have they been on the cutting edge? Are they a little bit behind the 8 ball? How would you view the Pac-12 and NIL at this stage?
I think they are a little bit behind the 8 ball, to be honest. There's not nearly as many of these donor collectives, and nor are they as passionate, the ones that do exist. I mean, maybe other than Oregon. I'm not sure that they're nearly as passionate as what you're seeing. I mean, Mississippi, Tennessee for sure, right? I mean, that's going to be a real issue for the conference is, a lot of their recruiting, if you look at NIL as a proxy for pay for play, right? A lot of it depends on how deep your donors' pockets are and how willing they are to commit money. And I don't think the Pac-12 has donor consortiums that can match with some of the other conferences. The market is probably going to correct in a couple of years, right? Some of these donors are going to think, I'm not spending $50,000 of my own money for a guy who's a backup guard, but it's going to take a little while to get to that point, and we can't assume that there's going to be federal legislation. So I think in the short term, the Pac-12 has got a little bit of a problem.
The late night games, of which sometimes, you hear that term Pac-12 after dark or whatever. John, I would think that some who live on the West Coast, Mountain Time or even West Coast time, they want to be able to watch a game, which is a good time for them, and not care whether anyone on the East Coast can watch it. Can they figure that out to where they get more exposure?
I think they can. I mean, part of the problem is that a bunch of those games are on the Pac-12 networks. So you got a 7:30 kickoff that is on a network that's not available, really, east of the Rocky Mountains. So that's one of the issues. I think that, and this is, again, my opinion, is that the 7:30 Pacific slot on ESPN is a pretty valuable broadcast window, right? There's nothing else going on. 10:30 is not that late East Coast, certainly 9:30 in the Central Time Zone. That people still want football at that hour, right? They're not done with their Saturday. So I think when the Pac-12 does its media rights, they need that ESPN 7:30 slot. They don't need 2 games on the Pac-12 networks. I'm not sure they need FS1, right? And the thing they don't need is the TV selection process where 1 month out of the season, fans out here don't know when their kickoff is until like the Sunday before the game, right? The ESPN and Fox have a 6-day selection option that covers a month of the season, and that makes it very hard. If you don't know what time your game is, 12:30 or 7:30 until the weekend before, it's very hard to plan.
Yeah, because the networks want to make sure they get the right matchups, the best matchups as well. Jon Wilner,
they do, and they paid for that. They paid for that right, and the Pac-12 was willing to sell out for the cash. The question is going to be when they go to the negotiating table again, where do they find that balance between selling out for the cash and doing what's going to help them fill their stadiums?
Jon Wilner, Pac-12 Hotline with us on Sikkim 365 Radio.
John, what did you think of the Pac-12's decision to scrap the divisions, and then how much that seemed to catch fire around the rest of the country afterwards?
Well, I mean, they were first out of the box, but I think we're going to see a lot of conferences are pretty far down the road on that. I think we'll see it in the next 6-12 months. Almost everybody's going to end up doing it. To me, it's smart because even if it's on the margins, it's improving your chances of getting into the playoff, right? Because now you're not in danger of having an 8-4 division winner upset an 11-1 division winner and knocking you out of the playoff. Because if it's your second place team, the odds are much better that team is, 10-2 or also 11-1. So that's not going to happen every year, but I think the Pac-12 is not in a position where it could take any chances, and it had to do everything possible to best position itself for a playoff bid, and making that change was very smart. They still haven't figured out if, like this coming season, if you look at the Pac-12 standings, will there be 2 divisions or just one group of 12 teams? They're going to figure that out this summer. They have, as a visual, they have not yet decided what to do about the divisions.
Who has to win? And I know Lincoln Riley now at USC and of course, Oregon. We know Utah is a hell of a team as well. Who needs to win for the Pac-12 to gain some national prestige back?
Oh, I mean, this is a gigantic season for USC and the conference, right? Lincoln Riley, Caleb Williams, right? They were the only spring game on ESPN. I mean, everybody's talking about Riley and SC. It is every USC game, and the TV ratings for every USC game is going to be really important for the Pac-12 this upcoming season. Even if the Trojans don't make the playoff, they have got to have a season where they are elite. Because if they do that, that will certainly elevate the Pac-12's brand and leverage at the negotiating table for those media rights. If you're talking about simply from a competitive standpoint, I happen to think Utah's got the best chance of getting in the playoff. And so from that perspective, the Utah-Florida game is gigantic for the conference.
Yeah, that's right. Early off the top, yeah.
John, why did it take USC so long to get out of the let's hire an really good football player to be the AD and hire a real AD?
I don't know. Just the culture of the institution, right? I mean, they were set. It's a private school. It is where the people making the decisions identify with USC. It's people in their 50s and 60s, regents and trustees and all that, donors. They identify with USC football from the 70s, 80s, even the 60s, and they were just kind of stuck in that mode. They needed to bring in new blood. Mike Bone, who was at Cincinnati and Colorado before that, has done a terrific job. Obviously, I mean, the Lincoln Riley hire, I think, is the most important coaching hire in the Pac-12 in decades. I mean, absolutely. Maybe going back to, you could argue Don James. When not Washington hired Don James, that was a pretty big deal. But given where the conference is now, where SC football has been, the Riley hire was huge, and I don't know that would have happened if they had gotten rid of Lynn Swan and replaced him with Keyshawn Johnson.
Yeah, it just seemed like they just hit it. Keyshawn, I like Keyshawn, and I think Keyshawn's a, he's a businessman more than he is an athlete. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, he was a great athlete, but I don't know that he's an athletic director. I mean, that's the thing. They needed somebody who had actually had real administrative experience and understood how to run a department, because it wasn't just their football program. They were having trouble on a whole bunch of fronts, and Mike Bohn has basically cleaned everything up.
Yeah, I'm talking about his post-career. Obviously, he was a great football player. I remember one time sitting down with him as a businessman, talking some business as well. John, the Pac-12 has schools that obviously sometimes can look down their nose at others. Do they get bothered at all by their reputation right now in football?
It depends on who you're talking about. The fans, the coaches, the athletic directors absolutely are aware of the reputation and are trying to fix it. But how many of the presidents are aware? I think more than used to be. They've had a bunch of presidents who have come in the last 5 or 6 years from other places, right? I mean, Kirk Schultz, who is in charge at Washington State, he was at Kansas State when the Big 12 went through their whole thing. So he understands what college football is like in other places. Robert Robbins at Arizona, he was at Mississippi State. So I think this influx of new presidents and chancellors in the last 5 or 6 years has helped kind of move the needle a little bit in terms of the presidents understanding how important it is to be good in football. And I think the change of the commissioner is helping too, because now there's a trust level and they're able to be kind of nudged forward on some stuff, whereas before they didn't trust Larry Scott, and so they weren't really willing to listen to him.
John, thank you. Appreciate your time. Good stuff. Pac-12 Hotline, Jon Wilner. Good to have you. Thanks for your time, Jon Wilner, with us on the Pac-12 and many things, from the grant of rights, the TV deal, the Pac-12 network, whatever it is, and really the reputation of the conference at times, which gets left out after the SEC Big Ten won 1A, and then there's this fight for who's the third one. And it's back and forth. And I think right now it's almost to the Pac-12 is floated down to the bottom. They don't want to hear that, but wouldn't you guys agree?
Yeah, I do think it's kind of sad that everybody's trying to be Avis Rent-A-Car. We were number 2 and we try harder in this whole thing, but that's the world we live in, that you're fighting like, we're the third best for sure, while having to admit that, yeah, we're never going to be the other 2.
Thanks for your time, Jon Wilner. When we come back, we'll hear